So what's a seam finish? A seam finish is when you add a finishing touch to the edge of your fabric. Let's look at a piece of fabric here. Let's look at this one. This is a good example. So a seam finish, after, sometimes you could do it before or after you stitch the fabrics together, but you finish these raw edges so that your fabric or garment doesn't fray. You see, if I don't finish this, this is gonna come apart all the way to the edge where I'm gonna stitch this. To prevent this unraveling of my fabric, I need to finish this edge. There are several ways, and for today, I'm gonna be going over pinked edges and then 2 different ways to overlock or serge your seam finish. First thing you want to do before you even decide what seam finish you want to apply. Oh, and before I continue, these are not the only methods for seam finishes. This is more of the basic type of seam finishes. There are a few more that are advanced, and I will go over the advanced ones in a future video. But this will get us going on some basic projects. So my plan is to go over maybe some of the most basic sewing techniques that you can apply to maybe 90% of your sewing projects. And then once I cover those, we can go through and talk about some advanced techniques that give you that couture or more advanced high-end look to your garments. But we won't be doing that yet. That's going to be in a future video. I would recommend that you have a few different types of fabrics. So I have a bulky fabric here. Then I have a very light and sheer weight fabric here. And then I have something that's just a medium weight cotton. And again, these are all woven, meaning they're not knit, they're not stretchy. Let's talk about the seam finish. So we're talking about pinked edges is the first one that we're going to discuss. Pinked edges is something you'll find on vintage clothes. Pinked edges are created using pinking shears. Pinking shears are, let's look at the scissors. These are pinking shears. They have these zigzag edges, and when you cut your edges with the pinking shears, it will prevent it from fraying. That is one way to finish your edges. And the order that you pink is important. We sew the plain seam first. Then after we've sewn it, we keep the seams together. We don't press them open, and we pink both edges at the same time. Now, if your fabric is very heavy or bulky for your shears, then in that case, you would go ahead and pink each edge separately. But otherwise, you would pink them together. For serged edges, there are 2 ways to serge your edges. You can serge the seam open, like this one, or you can put the seam edges together and serge them together. This would be more preferred on bulkier fabrics, so you can reduce the bulk of that seam. And then this one, depending, could be on lighter fabric or maybe a medium weight. So on a lightweight, you want to do maybe a 1/4 inch instead of a 1/2 inch. And then on medium weight, you might want to do a 1/2 inch. So if you don't have an overlock and you're watching this, it's okay. Instead of doing an overlock, these can be replaced with a zigzag stitch. So anywhere where I do overlock, you're going to do a zigzag. Let's go through and create our samples. So we're going to start with the pinked edges. And I'm going to do that with this. I'm going to leave my bulkiest and my lightest for the serged examples. And I'm going to use this just like a medium weight cotton here for our pinked. So right side's facing, we're going to go to the machine and we're going to just create a plain seam, stitch this at 5/8 seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. All right, so here at my machine, I'm going to stitch this together using a plain seam, which is 2.5 length, and I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and then again at the end. All right, now that we have our plain seam, we're gonna get our pinking shears, and I'm going to pink these edges. All right, so I have my 2 pieces together after I stitched it. Unfortunately, I didn't get on camera when I pinked these together, but I'll just go over it. You keep them together and pink them together so that they're even with each other if you can. If it's too bulky, then you can do them separately. After you pink them, you're gonna press that seam open. And then after you press it open, you'll go back to your machine and you'll just do a plain seam or stitch called a stay stitch along this edge at about 1/4 inch from the seam allowance. So you're going to go all the way down close to the pinked edge, and that'll keep it even further from fraying. In case these unravel, that stitching will prevent any fraying beyond that point. All right, so back at the machine, after you've pinked those edges with your pinking shears, I'm gonna stitch all the way across close to that edge, and I'm lining up the outside of the foot here with the seam so we can get it close to those edges. And you can back stitch here too if you want. And we're going to repeat it on the other seam as well. Again, lining up the edge of the foot right there. Okay, so this completes that pinked edge with the stay stitch to keep this seam from unraveling. All right, let's move on to the next one with the serged edges. Okay, so now the next sample we're gonna do is on my bulkier sample fabric. You don't have to have a bulkier, you can use any fabric that you have just to practice this technique. So this one we're gonna do an open open seam with serged edges on both sides. Now I'm gonna use my overlock machine. If you don't have an overlock, use your zigzag. Follow the same instructions that I'm gonna do with the overlock using your zigzag stitch on your machine. for this technique, we're going to overlock or zigzag the two edges of the seam first. So if you're doing an overlock, be careful not to cut any seam allowance. So my overlock will cut, but I can turn the knife off and just do the edges. You don't have to worry about this if you're doing a zigzag, because your zigzag, your machine doesn't have a knife, it's not going to cut anything. So again, we're going to serge each edge, not cutting off any of the seam allowance. After we have serged those two edges, I'm going to go to my regular machine. I'm going to place them right sides facing, and I'm going to stitch at my 5/8 seam allowance. All right, so here I am at my overlock, and on my machine, I have turned the knife off here, and you'll have to see on your machine how to turn it off. Mine has a little knob right there, and I just turn it to turn it on or off. And then I've lined up the edge of my fabric with the edge of where my stitch is going to be, making sure my two needles are going to serge right on the edge of this fabric. Again, if you don't have an overlock, it's okay. Follow the same step with your zigzag stitch on your machine. All right, that's one of those. And then now I'm gonna go ahead and do the other one. Make sure I'm doing the edge of the seam where I wanna put these two together so I don't do the wrong edge. And I'm putting mine face up. It really doesn't matter. You can have it face up or face down. It doesn't make a difference. All right, so now that I have both of these edges serged, I'm going to put these two fabrics facing each other, and I'm going to go to my regular machine, and I'm going to stitch these two pieces together. All right, so here I am at my machine. I've got my two pieces facing each other, right sides facing. I'm going to cut these extra threads here. Make sure that is lined up. And I'm going to line that up on my machine with the 5/8 seam guide here. And as usual, we're going to back stitch at the beginning and back stitch at the end. Okay, now that I've stitched those two together, I'm going to go to my iron and I'm going to press the seam open like so. And we're done with the sample. All right, so now that we have our sample with the pinked edges, and then we have our serged open seam finish, we're gonna move on to the last example, which is we serge the two edges together. And this one we did them open, so they're serged separately. So first we serged it, and then we stitch these two together. on this one. This is a lightweight sheer fabric. So I'm going to do this. You can do this at a 1/2 inch or a 1/4 inch. I'm probably going to do mine at a 1/2 inch. It doesn't matter. You just want to practice with one of those. So the key here is to put your fabric together before you stitch. We're going to serge these two together. And of course, if you don't have a serger, make sure you follow along same steps, but use the zigzag stitch on your machine. Okay, now back at the serger, I've got my 3rd sample and I have my knife turned off again because I'm not going to be cutting any extra off. You can if you want, if you have a serger, but remember, whatever you cut off, you have to adjust your seam allowance. So I'm not going to cut it off. That way, when I go to stitch these two together, I'm going to stitch at my 5/8 seam allowance. So knife is turned off and I'm just going to serge these two edges together. All right, now that we have these two edges serged together, move this thread out of the way. I'm going to go to my regular machine and I'm going to stitch at a 5/8 seam allowance. All right, so here I am back at the machine. I'm going to stitch this fabric at 5/8 seam allowance. Again, lining it up with my 5/8 seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and back stitch at the end. And that finishes the sample. And before we complete this on this sample, go ahead and press that seam to one side. All right, guys, that wraps up our finished seam samples with the pink and the 2 serged. One is open serged, one is closed serged. And now I'm going to take my 3 samples, and this is spraying a lot, so I might have to pink those before I put them in my notebook. So again, what I do is I put these in this little, this is probably not going to fit, but I'll have to cut it. So I'll put this in these inserts, these plastic inserts. You can get them on at your office supply store or on Amazon probably. And then I put the sample in there as well. And then I use this as a reference. You can use this as a reference to go back and remember how to do these techniques. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed this video lesson on seam finishes. If you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear your feedback. Let me know in the comments. If you want these as downloadables that you can print, let me know. I will make those available. And I'll see you guys in the next video. And again, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. All right, see you guys in the next video.